Okay, we are continuing our discussion of philosophy of science, and in the second video, we'll be talking mainly about Thomas Kuhn's postmodern view, or what's sometimes referred to as the radical view. And to get us started, I wanted to simply put up a comparison between Karl Popper's view, which is considered the more conventional view, versus the contemporary or postmodern view of Thomas Kuhn. And so what you should see from this slide is a comparison of the values and the beliefs about what science is and what science does from each of these two perspectives. So that the conventional view believes that, for instance, science is cooperative, that scientists are working together towards establishing the truth or the reality of the way things work. Whereas Kuhn's view is that science is competitive, that because of the way the scientific endeavor is structured, especially with regard to the need for grant money and funding and so forth, that in fact scientists compete against each other and that they aren't cooperative, and that scientists aren't involved in a nice kumbaya community that are all working together for truth. And in fact, they will often undermine each other, withhold data, and so forth. And so similarly, as you look down the list, I want you to realize the comparison and the contrast between what Popper's view is versus what Kuhn's view is. So that, for instance, the surprising assertion of Kuhn's view is that science is dogmatic, that it involves belief. And if you read the papers or pay attention to kind of the cultural messages in our society, that would never be something that you would think about science, that science is supposed to be above the idea of dogma and belief and so forth. And similarly, you see that the understanding of what happens to our knowledge base is different between Popper's view and Kuhn's view. So that Popper's view looks at accumulation of knowledge as kind of a stepwise increase in knowledge, that we get more and more truth, so to speak. Whereas for Kuhn, the change in knowledge is potentially lateral. In other words, that there's no real progress towards truth, there's just a paradigm shift. And so as a result, it's a perspective change, not an increase in knowledge or in truth. So to understand more fully why Kuhn's view seems radical, and interestingly, Kuhn's view tends to be attacked by those, especially in the natural sciences, the biomedical fields, and so forth, whereas Kuhn tends to have more sympathetic ears in the social sciences and the humanities departments at academic institutions. It's important for us to go into a bit more detail about exactly what he was suggesting is the characteristic of science. And so on this slide, I have listed the 4 components of Kuhn's framework, or his model for how science works. And so for a majority of the time, we operate in what's called, quote, normal science. And when we are in the stage of normal science, then the scientific endeavor basically fits with the conventional view. So everyone's operating under the same paradigm, and so therefore within that paradigm, we do seem to see an increase in knowledge and an increase towards a truer understanding. However, because we live in a sinful world, and Kuhn wasn't a Christian, so he wouldn't have probably asserted this, but if you also come at it from a Christian critical perspective, then if it's true that there is sin in the world, then that means that any process developed by humans is going to inherently be incomplete, maybe even incorrect in some ways. Kuhn talked about this as anomalies, so that what happens is, for any man-made paradigm, it is probably not going to be a completely 100% accurate view of the world, because we're sinful, we are incomplete, we have an incomplete knowledge, an incomplete view of the world, and so forth. And so as a result, anomalies, data that the paradigm can't explain, will start to crop up. And if enough of them crop up, then it can cause a crisis in the scientific community. And as we'll see soon, there are a number of ways that you can resolve that crisis. But if the crisis can't be averted, then you may end up with what's called a revolution, where a new paradigm or worldview for explaining these results is proposed, and there's basically a fight on your hands between the old and the new paradigm for the hearts and minds of scientists. And then, depending on which paradigm wins, then you end up returning to, quote, normal science, and then everything acts the same as it did. So we're now going to expand on the stages of Kuhn's model. And so on this slide, I simply elucidate or explain what normal science is. And so there's not much to add here that I haven't already discussed. But it's important to note, for instance, when these anomalies occur, at first they may be ignored or explained away. But if there are a sufficient number of these data anomalies that develop, then at some point they can't be ignored or explained away anymore. And so what happens then is what Kuhn called a crisis. And the three ways in which they can be resolved, or a crisis can be resolved, is that, first of all, the normal science, the original paradigm, finds a way to handle the anomalies and things return to normal. Secondly, the problems persist. The paradigm can't seem to handle these new anomalies, but the problem is simply set aside. It's put on a shelf so that, for instance, maybe when better technology comes along, then we'll be able to resolve the problem and it'll still fit within the original paradigm. The third way that the crisis can be resolved, however, is that someone suggests a new paradigm that both explains what the old paradigm does or explains, and also explains some of the things that the old paradigm cannot explain. But the crisis can only be resolved with a revolution if there's a viable contender. And so, for instance, as an example of the scientific community being kind of in a state of crisis, but not necessarily willing to debate another paradigm, is the whole issue of Darwinian natural selection versus what's often referred to as the intelligent designer theory. So that the mainstream scientific community simply won't even suggest that there is a viable contender for a new paradigm. That in many ways, many in the scientific community are so committed to the worldview and the paradigm of Darwinian natural selection and its removal of any type of supernatural actor as being part of our world, that even in the face of a number of anomalies, they are unwilling to even suggest that intelligent design might be a viable alternative paradigm. And so in this case, they're basically stuck in crisis with no way of resolving that because they don't believe that the intelligent designer theory is a viable contender as a new paradigm. If, however, a viable contender does arise, then you have a revolution. And so what happens is that at first, very few people support the new paradigm, usually younger people or people who are newer to the field because they haven't been indoctrinated into the old paradigm as much. And also, during the early stages of the new paradigm, there are a number of what we'd call sacrificial lambs, people who end up being unable to get published, who don't get hired, and so forth, because the people who control all the power are still all under the old paradigm. But over time, you start to see converts to the new paradigm, if the new paradigm is the one that's going to end up winning. And so the strength for support for the new paradigm continues to increase. And then at some point, there becomes a critical mass of people throwing their allegiance behind the new paradigm, and it takes over. And at the conclusion of the revolution, there still may be some people holding on to the old paradigm, but they tend to be people that the followers of the new paradigm are simply going to kind of wait them out, so to speak. So they'll let them retire out, or they'll die from old age, or so forth. And so eventually then the hold of the new paradigm becomes complete. It's important to note, however, that according to the Kuhnian model, a new paradigm might not necessarily be more true than the old paradigm. It simply holds more sway. In other words, it seems more elegant. And so these people who were holdouts for the old paradigm may not have been wrong, but they're on the outside of the mainstream community, which has now bought into the new paradigm. So the final thing to talk about is, if this is true, if Kuhn's view is true, why, as grade schoolers, middle schoolers, high schoolers, and even college students, you have never heard of this history of revolutions in science? And the fact is that Kuhn suggested that revolutions end up becoming invisible for a number of reasons. The main reason is that the people who write the textbooks end up distorting and reconstructing the history in such a way that they basically incorporate the new paradigm's view of the world into their reinterpretation of the history of science, or at least the history of that particular field in science. And so it makes everything look like it was this nice, constant progression in truth, using the new paradigm as an interpretive lens to understand the history of that field. And so for that reason, then, you end up having these revolutions hidden, becoming invisible, according to Kuhn. The final thing to talk about with regard to Kuhn's model is, in fact, the difference between Kuhn and some of his followers in terms of their postmodern view of science. And so, as I note here on the slide, both Kuhn and Popper were what we call critical realists. In other words, they didn't deny the fact that there is a reality out there. There is really something out there, and that science can actually tell us something about it. They disagreed on the extent to which science can access and tell us anything about the world, but they didn't disagree on the fact that there is actually a world out there, there is a real reality, and that we have access to learning about it. Some of the disciples of Kuhn, people who followed after him, however, took an even more radical position called subjective relativism. They believed that, quote, reality, and notice I had to put quotes around it, is socially constructed. That, in fact, we don't have access to a real reality, that we basically make it up based on our paradigms. And so that there is no way for us to say anything objective about the world out there, that all of our, quote, understanding, unquote, of the world is really an interpretive process and an interpretation of data, such that what we think of as reality is really just, for lack of a better way of saying it, quote, in our heads, unquote. And so to conclude, I want you to think about the conventional contemporary view and then subjective relativism. And I've posed a number of questions for you to think about, so that to the extent that any view is reflecting an aspect of truth, we as Christians can affirm it. And so for each of these views, the conventional view, the contemporary view, that is Kuhn's view, and then also subjective relativism, which is the more radical view, think about what is useful about this view as Christians, but also what is dangerous or problematic about this view when evaluated from the Christian perspective. And so it's these questions that we will deal with in class.